Hello, and welcome to our private cellar insight into the Burgundy 2021 vintage. I'm Laura Taylor, and I'll be chatting with our Master of Wine, Nicola Arcedeckne-Butler, to find out more about the 2021 growing season, the people behind Private Cellar's Burgundy portfolio, the resulting wines, the market, and of course how the campaign will unfold. Wine writer Bill Nansen opens his Burgundy report by saying, "The wines of 2021 are going to put a smile on your face," calling it a very modern classic, and we absolutely agree with him. To really get a complete picture of the vintage, Nicola spent 2 weeks in Beaune in October, travelling up and down the Côte d'Or to meet with growers, winemakers and wine writers, getting the lowdown from all angles and tasting hundreds of wines. Here we've put a little map for you of Burgundy. You'll see Beaune just left of centre. It actually, for us here, runs east to west, but of course Burgundy runs north to south. So Beaune is just to the south of the centre. I joined Nicola for a few days in the middle of her trip. So to set the scene, here are a few photos of our visits, with a map showing the lay of the land here, and the easy access from Beaune to all of the vineyards. We started off in the north at Domaine de l'Arlo, a domain that you may well recognise for its beautiful property. And this is a picture further south with Nicola with Céline Fontaine at Domaine Fontaine-Gagnard. We also visited Marion Javillier at Domaine Patrick Javillier to taste just a few wines, sadly, because they lost a lot of their Chardonnay to frost. And this is a picture that we saw quite often throughout Burgundy, which we'll be talking about a little later. And finally, here's Axelle Machat de Gramont, looking at the tiny quantities of her Vosne Romanée Les Barreaux. She just made this tiny tank. The quantities really are quite small in some areas. And the pretty colours of the 2021 Burgundy. So that's just a little overview of our visit. So Nicola, to really understand the vintage, I think we have to talk about the weather. So what were the main weather events of 2021?
Well, 2021 is a vintage which is all about the weather. And obviously, it's an agricultural product, so clearly weather's important. But 2021, the real issue was that there was a very warm spurt in sort of February, March time, which made the vines wake up and start going. Sadly, followed at the very first week of April, between the 7th and 9th of April, with 3 successive nights of frost. So the standard things are you go out and light your candles, and the growers all set themselves alarms for the candles, and they were slightly shocked on the first day when they went out to do the candles to be greeted by inches of sloppy snow. Snow is bad. Sloppy snow is a real issue because of the water, and then the temperatures subsequently dropped to -8 in some vineyards, which means that sloppy snow completely froze around the vines and around the buds, and everything was destroyed pretty well on the first night. But just in case it wasn't, 2 subsequent nights of frost made sure that anything that had survived the first night didn't survive the next 2. It was a black winter frost rather than a white frost, which meant that the destruction was total. Problem was that Chardonnay buds early. Chardonnay was out with its first leaves and buds, and that was what was damaged. And Chardonnay does not bud well. It has secondary buds that they don't tend to be very generous or very fruitful. Pinot Noir was luckier. It's a later budder and tended to be mostly okay. However, the frost was more severe down in the Côte de Beaune. So people with Pinot Noir in and around Beaune struggle more than, for example, people with Pinot Noir up in the Côte de Nuit, around Nuit Saint-Georges and Gevrey-Chambertin. That wasn't all. As any of us may remember from our 2021 summer season here in the UK, it was pretty grey, pretty grim. There was an awful lot of rain, cloud, overcast, and sadly those are perfect growing grounds for various mildews, oidium and mildew itself. Complete nightmare for a lot of growers. It meant a lot of hours in the vineyard, spraying, treating, just observing, just being there to make sure that you saw the first marks of mildew creeping on the leaves, to get in there in time to make sure it didn't get onto the fruit. So it meant a lot of man hours, a lot more man hours than it would normally have meant. And this carried on really through until mid-August. Mid-August, it started to warm up a bit, but it was cool as well, was the other problem. So mid-August, it started to warm up a bit. So the first couple of weeks in September, they finally had some good weather. sun, not hot, but sun and some wind, which allowed the mildew and potential rot threat to dissipate, and allowed the fruit to ripen up to its full levels. And then the final straw was probably rain, severe rain that happened at the weekend around the 18th, 19th of September. For many people, they either harvested before that or they had to wait beyond that. And at that stage, the fruit was just about ripe in the reds. The whites were fine and were being harvested around then. So it was a real vintage of brinksmanship and a real grower know-how, understanding their vineyards, understanding how to work their vineyards and how to produce the best they could out of what was a very, very difficult growing season. And in fact, Celine Fontaine, who you showed earlier, said last year when we went to visit her, she said, frankly, we're exhausted. That was her sum up of the 2021 harvest, which is pretty sad because normally the Burgundy growers have managed to smile in the face of adversity for the last 10 years. So that was a sad moment.
So that must have been very difficult, especially for the organic growers as well, particularly difficult in the vineyards. But thinking of the weather patterns, are there any interesting viticultural practices that we're seeing now in Burgundy that will help us set the scene for this vintage in particular?
Well, more and more they're pruning late, because they've worked out that if you prune late, it delays budding. There's obviously a point where it's too late to prune, and they've got a lot of vines to prune all by hand, so they can't leave it too late. But by the later they leave the pruning, the later it leaves the budding. It can make a difference of 2 to 3 weeks, as much as that on some years. So that can be very important. Had they had the opportunity to leave it a bit longer, then they may have been able to avoid the frost this year, but people are starting to do that. Not all of them are succeeding. Different training, which takes a long time on the vineyard to change the training of the vineyard, but different trainings are having an impact on frost. So there's a lot of experimentation going on, and it's becoming clear that with climate change, more extreme weather appears to be the way it's going. So it's going to be colder temperatures or hotter temperatures and bigger differentials. So there's a lot of experimentation going on as to what they can do to mitigate going forward.
And what about for the frost with the candles and so on?
Well, there's interestingly, and there's still beautiful pictures of the whole of the Côte de Beaune lit up, but actually a lot of growers now are talking about not using candles. Pierre-Henri Rougeau in Meursault said the problem with candles is they pollute, and you're burning kerosene in the vineyard and making this thick black smoke to protect. And there is a pollution issue. 10 years ago, or less than that, sorry, 2016, with the big frost in 2016, in Chassagne, they protected the vineyard through burning bales of straw. And it was quite effective, and it stopped the sun rays in the morning, basically burning the leaves through the layer of ice that was still on them. And that was fine, but there were complaints about with breathing, all sorts of issues going on like that. So people are moving away from it and then looking for alternatives. There are now big fans people are using, which blow air around the vineyard. Some people are additionally putting a generator next to the fan to produce a bit of heat to blow warm air around the vineyard, but they only have a limited reach. And of course, if you're lighting a generator, you're still creating fumes.
Are they allowed to start using these heated wires in Burgundy yet on the trellises, or are they too expensive? Or
I think, well, they're all talking about it, but I think they're all slightly in horror about A, the cost, and B, who knows what it's going to do. Is it going to be enough?
does it change the microclimate in the terroir, perhaps?
It won't change the terroir, but it will change the microclimate, but only during no more than probably putting a heated helicopter going around. I don't think it changes the microclimate on a micro level, but not on a daily level, and certainly not in terms of ripening. So it probably would be okay.
And then what about in the cellar? Because with 70% reduction in yields, and certainly for some of the Chardonnays, there must be some different vinification practices, smaller vessels perhaps, or different practices in the cellar. Did you hear anything about those?
Oh, all sorts. The biggest issue for those growers who don't like to use a lot of new oak, when you're only making 2 barrels, you either have no new oak or 50% new oak. There's no halfway house. So many didn't have as many new barrels as they normally would. A lot of them returned back to 1-year-old and 2-year-old barrels, which they would have used anyway, but with no new oak, rather than having the wine overwhelmed by oak. The biggest issue is something I've never really thought about in the past. There's always been, every cellar you go to, there are these sort of stainless steel tanks, small ones, within the cellar where the barrels are. And that's what they use for topping up. So the wine is absorbed by the barrel, it naturally evaporates a bit, and then people like me come and taste it. So some gets taken out. And they always top up the barrel with exactly the same cuvee, but which isn't in barrel. And this year they were struggling to find small stainless steel tanks small enough to hold that small amount they need to top up their 3 barrels instead of their 15 barrels, say. And for many, there was a big reluctance, understandably, in investing in hardware like new barrels, new stainless steel, which is very expensive, when you've only got 30% of your normal harvest. And it's a real dilemma for them.
I think that picture of Axel with her tiny barrel of Vionnet Barrow, having to use a sort of almost like a vacuum seal on the tank to
well, as you can see from her leaning into it, it's not full. It's far from full. It's only about 2/3 full. And the other problem was that they have to use, quite a few of them have used feuillettes, and there's another small barrel, I can't remember the name, even smaller. A feuillette is a half barrel. And then there was somebody who had a quarter barrel because that was all they could produce. And you think, well, what do? Either you make your wine with absolutely no wood, or you cross blend. And so some cross blended. So you've got several people who put Premier Cru's into one and have renamed it, given it a new name. Laurent Cognac at his Montagne Les Basses is his Premier Cru he had enough of. But his other Premier Crus, he has another 4 Premier Crus, but he's put them into one cuvee called Le Rarisme, so the rarest. Because he said, I just create a name. They can't call it any of the individual Premier Crus. You have to have some name. He didn't want to just say Montagne Premier Cru blanket. So that's what quite a few have done. Some have tried not to do that, but you require, you need to have a certain volume, and a barrel is 300 bottles, 225 litres. So you need to have just more than that to be able to fill your barrel in the first place.
Of course. And what about sulfur, the issue of sulfur? A lot of people ask us often about the use of sulfur in wine. I know when we visited Domaine Rougeot, there was an interesting example of the use of sulfur.
Rougeot is particularly interesting because Pierre-Henri and his father are both actually allergic to sulfur. When I say allergic, I'm not talking about allergic to sulfur in your wine. I'm talking about proper allergy to sulfur, to the extent they wear masks, gas masks, when they're sulfuring in the cellar. They have to sulfur in the cellar. Sulfur is a natural preservative. It's very, very important in wine. It's also naturally occurring in wine. So the chance of having a wine that is totally sulfur-free is only going to happen through filtration or something else being done to it afterwards. It's a natural byproduct of fermentation from the grape. But more importantly for them, what Pierre-Henri does, which is really interesting, he tries to use as little as possible because he doesn't like using it, and he thinks it makes interesting wines. So he will have the same wine in however many barrels, for the sake of argument, 10 barrels of one wine, and he will taste and taste and taste and taste each month. As soon as a barrel shows anything which indicates that it needs sulfuring, so that's particularly going to be is too reductive, it's got too many other things going on, potentially going to go a bit squiffy, he sulfurs. There's no question about that. But at the end, when it comes to bottling time, if he's still happy with the 1 or 2 barrels that don't have sulfur in, they get bottled independently under a completely new name, a completely different name, not a new name, but a completely different name, as is without sulfur cuvee. And it's fascinating. So what you and I tasted in the cellar, Laura, could still become we tasted them without sulfur because they're at an early stage of development. It could still become a no sulfur cuvee, or it may not. I think it's fascinating. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and he uses a different label as well, and a sort of angle, doesn't he, to show the no sulfur ones?
Exactly.
So with all these low volumes and all the stories about low volumes, how does this impact allocations this year? I know the reds are not as impacted as the whites, but how did you find you were welcomed by the cellars, and what were the growers' reports on allocations this year?
The allocation is always inevitably going to be tight. If you've lost 70% of your harvest and you normally sell 90% of it, that's a lot of people who are going to get either small allocations or no allocations. Thankfully, because I was spending quite a lot of time there, and because we've worked with, I think, pretty well all our growers we've worked with for a long time, almost since Private Cellar started, we have maintained our allocations in terms of the number of wines. Inevitably, there have been cutbacks in terms of quantity. Some have tried to keep us as close to normal as possible, but inevitably, I'm aware of the fact if they've done that, then there's somebody else who's probably going to be very unhappy somewhere else. Allocations are going to be tight. Premier and Grand Cru in 2016 with the frost, Premier and Grand Cru were less impacted. And so actually that was a bizarre situation where you had less of the Bourgogne Blanc and Bourgogne Rouge, but you have more Premier and Grand Cru proportionately. Unfortunately, this year, it's across the board. The frost hit right up top of the hill to the bottom of the hill. Absolutely nothing was spared in terms of Chardonnay, in terms of the areas. So allocations are going to be tight, and we will inevitably have to disappoint customers somewhere along the line. So my message to everyone is get in early.
So that brings us on to the question of quality. Given the challenges of the vintage, I think it is quite hard to make a terrible wine these days with all the technology and know-how and education and expertise that vignerons have now. But what about the quality of the wines? And is there any particular vintage comparison, that dreaded question, that you can compare the 2021s to?
Personally, I find it very hard to compare it to anything, partially because the improvements in technology over the past 10 years, and really there hasn't been a bad vintage in the last 10 years. 2013 was challenging, but very differently challenging. And the increase in technology has been such that they can mitigate against so much of what the challenges are, what's being thrown at them. Plus, everybody is very, very aware of the fact they don't want to include bad fruit. And 30 years ago, I think most growers would have been perfectly happy to admit that they picked, it went in the vat. Now it's sorted at picking, so the harvesters are sorting, it's being sorted in the cellar, and it's being sorted again before it goes into the vats itself. So there's a lot less dodgy fruit, for want of a better description, going into the vat than there would have been several years ago or 2 generations ago. The quality, I have to say, I was bowled over by the whites. Absolutely bowled over. They are delicious. I mean, obviously they are as rare as hen's teeth, but they are absolutely delicious. They are fresh, they're racy. If you look at my tasting notes for the last 3 years, 18, 19, 20, it's all about tropical fruits. It's passion fruit, it's grapefruit, it's all warm temperature fruit. This year is back onto citrus, it's back onto white flowers, lemon, really pure mineral, racy, vibrant flavors. And it's for me, it's really exciting. I love the warm fat style, but this is really exciting. They're really delicious whites. The reds are harder to call. We've become very used to very rich, lush, velvety reds. That's not really Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is about delicacy, elegance, red fruits. And 2021 is all about red fruit. There's none of this black fruit. I'm really not calling in any of my sort of my deep coloured fruits into this year's tasting. It's very much raspberries, strawberries, loganberries, perhaps a bit of mulberry, racy, fresh, and they've got lovely minerality. And tasting the 2021s against the 2020s, when you taste the 20s, you think, oh my God, there's something faulty about this wine because it's just so shockingly big in comparison to the beautifully refined 21s. They're not, the whites I think will make old bones. The reds, I don't think will make as old bones as, say, the 18s, 19s, or 20s, but they will be good for the medium term. And much more to the point, they will provide really pleasurable drinking. And even more excitingly, alcohol levels are back to where they should be. So you're looking at really, for the whites, anywhere between 12 and 13 and a half maximum. And for the reds, you're looking at maximum of 13.5% alcohol, and that compares in the last few vintages of wines where they've been creeping up to 14.5. Some have even hit 15.
That sounds like all really good news, and to have a really good drinkable vintage where we don't have to wait for ages for the wines to come around is actually very exciting. I suppose one question I wanted to ask you before we get on to the question of pricing is, I know it's impossible to choose really, but did you have a particular highlight of your trip? I'm just looking at the picture behind you, and I think mine was probably the enormous walk we did from Meursault to Puligny to Chassagne and back again. I think it was 27,000 steps. And along with that, to visit de Vaudoisie, because I have a particular soft spot for it. I think they're very exciting wines. But how about you? Did you have a particular highlight of the trip?
For me, the highlight was probably de Mendellale is always a highlight. The wines are always so beautifully elegant and racy and pedigreed, and they are definitely this year again. Jean-Michel Chartrand, delicious wines. I tasted the entire range, which normally we don't have time to do, and I had time to do this time, which was really interesting tasting, particularly in a vintage where the individual vineyard characteristics really stand out more than they have done in previous vintages. So to taste 3 or 4 Puligny Premier Crus against each other it's an experience. It's an experience, but it also helps you to really lock in to what it is about that grower that particularly we like and which works well. Vaudoisie is always good because I think it's so exciting. Young growers doing exciting things is always great news. But generally, for me, the most exciting thing was just having more time to spend with our growers and really getting to the bottom of what was going on with that vintage, but also hearing their excitement about the 2022s, which is quite fun for them to have something bright to look forward to is always great. And yes, walking from Merceau all the way down, all the way along to the Grand Crus and through into Chassagne-Montrachet. That was fantastic. 25 degrees heat in late October. Can't ask for more.
It was lovely. So on to the question of pricing. I know it's a difficult question to answer because we haven't received all of the prices and all of the allocations yet, but how are you finding the prices coming through?
Well, the poor growers, they're stuck in a cleft stick. They don't want to push the prices up any further than Burgundy prices are already going. But when you've only had 2 harvests in the last 3 years, you still have bills to pay. You still have to pay your tax. You still have to pay your workers, your water bills, electricity bills. And we all know where they've all gone. Some people put their prices up a bit last year in order to do 2 steps rather than a giant sort of hike. Some people have had to put it all up this year. It's a bit of a mix. There's a real mixed bag. Most of them are resenting having to increase their prices by the level they are, which is always nice to hear. There will be some price increases, particularly on the Premier and Grand Crus, because yields are so low. We're talking about yields where normally they'd have 45 hectolitres per hectare, and this year they've had 5 to 8. So it's a massive reduction. So no, not all the prices are in. Some people have kept them the same as last year. Some people have gone up to around 40% increase. It's completely anyone's bet.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Nicola, for this insight. I have to say, I really loved the wines. I really enjoyed tasting them. And for me, it's really great to see a vintage with so much energy in the wines. I found them all very much alive, and I'm excited to offer them. So for everyone watching this, do please visit our offers tab on the website at www.privatecellar.co.uk. We'll put a link in the notes to this video. You'll find there our vintage report, which Nicola has written, and you'll also find links to the offer as soon as it comes out. Nicola has written almost 150 tasting notes, which is no mean feat when they're all Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and they are all different, and they're all very much a reflection of what she tasted with our growers in their cellars. So if you haven't been in touch with your salesperson already to discuss your requirements, please do get in touch. We're always here, and we'd much rather talk to you than chat on email. So please do give your salesperson a call or ask them to call you. And it's worth repeating that customers who want to buy the wines at the very top level, because there is so little around, we will be allocating with preference to those buying across the board. Remember, there are some very deliciously drinkable village wines, especially in this vintage. And then finally, to hear more from those on the ground, we have some ready-to-drink vintages of Burgundy in our A Glass with Our Growers series. We've got one on the 1st of February with Domaine Matro, with Adele and Elsa Matro, talking about their Merceau domain. They'll be talking about the 2021 vintage and also past vintages with my colleague Letty Farden. So please do have a look in the links to this video. There'll be a link to buy a case for that. It's 3 bottles of wine. There's a Zoom call, and we found that people are really enjoying inviting their friends around to share the wines with them. So we hope that you will join that. And if you can't join, there'll be a catch-up link, so you can still buy the wines and watch on the catch-up. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Nicola. And we look forward to sharing these lovely 2021 Burgundies with you.